Most movie sequels these days have something in common. They're released pretty quickly after the previous film in the franchise. Sometimes, however, it takes a good few years to get that sequel going, and sometimes it takes decades. Here are some of those movies. After defeating the Soviets in 1988's Rambo 3, John Rambo decided to hang up the old bandana for 2 whole decades. In fact, the Vietnam vet turned international action hero wouldn't return until 2008 with the appropriately titled Rambo. The 4th installment of the First Blood franchise, Rambo finds Sly Stallone's world-weary soldier heading into the Burmese jungle to rescue a group of missionaries. Of course, after 20 years, Rambo's a little bit slower and a whole lot wrinklier. So why did it take so long for Stallone to get his beloved Green Beret back in action? Well, according to Stallone himself, he just couldn't find a story that grabbed his attention. The actor briefly considered sending Rambo down to Mexico to rescue a kidnapped girl, but ultimately scrapped that idea and settled on having Rambo stick up for the displaced Karen people. Sadly, though, absence doesn't always make the heart grow fonder, and neither audiences nor critics were really clamoring for a sequel all those years later. Currently, Rambo is both the lowest-grossing and worst-reviewed film of the franchise. When the original Independence Day landed in theaters in 1996, the alien invasion flick abducted over $800 million at the box office, and it seemed like a sequel should have been the obvious next step. But even though there was talk of a follow-up as early as 2002, it took the alien mothership quite a while to return to Earth. 2 whole decades, in fact. According to director Roland Emmerich, there's a good reason why it took so long for Independence Day to resurge. Speaking with Entertainment Weekly, Emmerich explained that he's always been against sequels and would only consider making one when he can see a way to make it not look or feel like a sequel. Nevertheless, 20 years after the first film, Independence Day flew back into theaters with the long-gestating sequel, Resurgence. Unfortunately, the second movie was missing 2 major things: Will Smith and an audience. The movie was a flop, and the chances are good these evil extraterrestrials won't be coming back to Earth anytime soon. Based on the novel by Irvine Welsh, 1996's Trainspotting is the pitch-black comedy that first put Ewan McGregor and director Danny Boyle on the map. But the ending left a lot of people wondering just what happened to protagonist Mark Renton. Well, literature lovers got their answer in 2002 when Irvine Welsh wrote a follow-up to his classic novel, but film fans had to wait a little bit longer. Why is that? Original screenwriter John Hodge did actually try to adapt Welsh's second book, but the script just didn't work out. As well as that, once frequent collaborators McGregor and Boyle had a huge falling out after a debacle surrounding 2000's The Beach. Boyle led McGregor to believe he would play the lead in the film, but the director picked Leonardo DiCaprio instead. Afterward, the two didn't speak for about 10 years, which played a huge part in keeping Trainspotting 2 away from theaters.
Yeah, we didn't speak for a long time, which was such a waste.
Eventually, McGregor and Boyle made amends, and soon after, there was serious momentum behind the scenes. One week in 2015, Boyle and the creative team behind the first Trainspotting spent some time brainstorming a way to make the sequel work, and Hodge was finally inspired to write another screenplay, one that mixed parts of Welsh's sequel with a number of modern elements. The result? 2017's T2 Trainspotting. Some people love Henry Cavill, some prefer Tyler Hoechlin, but when it comes time to playing the Man of Steel, nobody does it better than Christopher Reeve. He first donned the red cape in 1978's Superman and came back 3 more times to save the world. But Superman 3 and 4 weren't classics, to say the least, and their failures killed the franchise for 19 years. Over the next couple of decades, Hollywood tried desperately to bring the son of Krypton back to the silver screen. J.J. Abrams wrote a script called Superman Flyby, Tim Burton and Nicolas Cage tried to get Superman Lives off the ground, and some people even considered pitting Batman against Superman long before Zack Snyder's movie came about. Finally, in 2006, Bryan Singer teamed up with Brandon Routh for Superman Returns, a movie that's actually part of the Christopher Reeve series. However, Singer's version totally ignores the 3rd and 4th film in the Reeve franchise. Instead, it picks up after Superman 2, which hit theaters 26 years prior. The Singer film is loaded with references to the Reeve movies, including the voice and image of the then recently deceased Marlon Brando as Kal-El. Unfortunately for poor Brandon Routh, Superman Returns has largely been forgotten by fans. But hey, at least the guy is still getting a little work in the world of DC. Starring the one and only Jeff Bridges, Tron paved the way for the CG world we live in today. And sure, the visual effects might look a little dated by today's standards, but today's standards wouldn't even exist without this 1982 cult classic. Sadly, as sci-fi movies like The Matrix took CGI to greater and greater heights, it looked like the world didn't need Tron anymore. Then, in 2007, the folks at Disney decided to rev up their light cycles and take Tron out for another spin by hiring Joseph Kosinski to direct a sequel. Hoping to build excitement for the film and show everybody the look of the world, the filmmakers created a super expensive trailer and debuted their short film at the 2008 Comic-Con. The reaction encouraged Disney to go ahead with Tron Legacy. The 2011 sequel gave the world 2 Jeff Bridges for the price of 1, not to mention a pretty cool score from Daft Punk. Unfortunately, the 28-year gap between the films had dampened audiences' excitement to see another installment in the franchise, resulting in a movie that didn't exactly light the world on fire. In other words, don't expect to see Tron 3 anytime soon. In 1979, Mel Gibson climbed behind the wheel of the V8 Interceptor and roared into cinemas with Mad Max. The Australian actor would reprise the role 2 more times, becoming the Road Warrior and finally going beyond Thunderdome. Of course, Gibson always rode across the wastelands with director George Miller, the visionary behind the Dusty Dirty franchise. But after their 1985 collaboration, the series ran out of gas. Then, in 1998, Miller was minding his own business, literally walking across a road, when he got the idea for a new Mad Max movie. The director wanted to start shooting in 2001, but 9/11 happened, wrecking the economy and screwing up the film's budget. It also didn't help that Mel Gibson was about to have a major public meltdown and reveal himself to be, well, kind of controversial.
4 years after Oscar winner Mel Gibson made headlines for using an anti-Semitic statement, it seems that his mouth may have gotten him in trouble again.
So the 4th Mad Max film was put on hold for a grand total of 30 years until Miller, Tom Hardy, and Charlize Theron finally came together to create the best film of the entire franchise, Fury Road. And sure, it took 3 decades to get going, but let's be honest, it was more than worth the wait. Tom Cruise came onto the scene with Risky Business, but it was Top Gun that made him the bona fide movie star that he is today. And since everybody knows that Tom Cruise is a bit of an adrenaline junkie, one who absolutely loves sequels featuring crazy stunts, it seems like a Top Gun 2 would have been the most obvious thing in the world. But Cruise took a heck of a long time to climb back into that cockpit. True, there were rumors in 2010 that he'd take to the skies once again, but Top Gun director Tony Scott's tragic suicide in 2012 kept the sequel from getting clearance for a few more years. However, the movie did finally take off, and Top Gun Maverick will be soaring into theaters in 2020, a whopping 34 years after the franchise first took to the skies. Here's hoping for more volleyball, more motorcycles, and more highways to the danger zone. It may seem unthinkable now, but Blade Runner was a major bomb when it was released in 1982. All these decades later, however, Ridley Scott's tale of robots on the run has become one of the most beloved and influential films in sci-fi history. And to many, it was basically an untouchable movie. But there were 2 people who thought maybe a Blade Runner sequel might work: Bud Yorkin and his wife Cynthia Sykes. Yorkin was one of the producers of the original film, and along with co-producer Jerry Perenchio, owned the rights to its story. For a long time, neither producer wanted to do anything with the property. But once Yorkin and Sykes started thinking about a part 2, they brought up Perenchio and got busy expanding Rick Decker's world. Initially, Ridley Scott was going to direct, but a certain other sequel to one of the director's classics sidelined the English filmmaker. So Denis Villeneuve of Sicario and Arrival fame was tapped to sit behind the camera. With Harrison Ford starring alongside Ryan Gosling, Blade Runner 2049 hit theaters in 2017, 35 years after the original debut. While the movie wasn't a box office smash, it did impress critics, and the film finally earned the much-deserving and oft-overlooked Roger Deakins an Oscar for Best Cinematography. When Mary Poppins was released in 1964, audiences were eager to step in time with the film's catchy songs, and the movie earned a staggering 13 Oscar nominations. Julie Andrews even went home with the Little Gold Trophy for Best Actress, and the movie turned her into a major star. But there was one person who absolutely hated the film: P.L. Travers, the author who first introduced Poppins to the world. Travers absolutely detested the upbeat adaptation, so when Walt Disney asked if they could adapt another one of her 8 books about the prim and proper Poppins, Travers shut Disney down there and then. Disney head Jeffrey Katzenberg would resume conversations with Travers throughout his tenure at the company, but the irascible author made things so difficult that Katzenberg just gave up. There wasn't any movement on the Mary Poppins front until Travers passed away in 1996. About 16 years after her death, the folks at Disney approached the author's estate again, and this time they actually got the go-ahead. Sadly, Julie Andrews was too old to reprise the role, but 54 years after the original film, Emily Blunt did a practically perfect job of playing everybody's favorite flying nanny. Directed by Alfred Hitchcock, Psycho is arguably one of the finest horror movies ever made. It's the granddaddy of the slasher genre and gave the world one of the all-time great villains with Norman Bates, not to mention making an entire generation afraid of hotel showers. But this 1960 horror flick wasn't exactly begging for a sequel. The original ends with Norman locked inside a mental asylum, his secrets revealed, and his mind completely gone. But when did a solid conclusion ever stop anyone from making a sequel? The next installment of the Psycho series first came in book form. The original film was based on a novel by Robert Bloch, and the author followed up his pulp thriller in 1982 with a book that has elsewhere been described as unfilmable. In fact, it's so nuts that Universal Studios had no desire at all to adapt Bloch's new novel. Instead, they decided to make their own with a completely different plot. They hired Tom Holland, no, not that one, to write the script, and they were originally going to make it a TV movie starring Christopher Walken. But then the OG slasher himself, Anthony Perkins, fell in love with the script and returned for the role. Once Perkins was on board, Universal turned Psycho 2 into a fully theatrical film. By the time the movie hit theaters, it had been 23 years since Norman first went all kill crazy in that motel bathroom. And while it's probably true that Hitchcock's classic didn't need a sequel, Psycho 2 has its fair share of defenders, so it wasn't a total waste at least. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more Looper videos about your favorite movies are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.